What's this? A brief history that might actually be brief? Well, we'll see about that.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
I may surprise myself by how much I can find about this subject. Today we're going to talk about one of the fastest aircraft ever built, the first spaceplane ever built, the suborbital rocket with wings attached as an afterthought, the North American X-15. Now, before we go any further, let's take a moment and talk about sleep. This channel is all about learning, and the best way to learn is after a good night's sleep. The best way to get a good night's sleep is with a quality sleep mask. This video is sponsored by Manta Sleep, provider of the most advanced sleep masks and accessories. If you've used a sleep mask before, well, first of all, I recommend it if you haven't, but you're likely familiar with masks that are essentially one size fits all. With Manta, that's not the case. Their masks are fully adjustable, not just through the Velcro head strap, but also removable eye cups. Not everybody's head is the same size and shape, so Manta masks allow you to adjust and reposition the eye cups to fit your head perfectly. What's more, the cups perfectly hug your eyes in a way that lets no light in whatsoever. Perfect darkness to sleep through the night. There's a variety of masks to choose from their original mask to the silk mask to the sound sleep mask, as well as several accessories to enhance your sleeping experience. Cool eye cups to soothe your eyes and sinuses, steam cups to relieve dry eyes, and aroma dots to add a hint of pleasant scent to your sleeping environment. The masks have an incredibly pleasant, soft, high-quality feel, and the materials are very subtly permeable. I tend to sleep with a fan on, and I can still feel that soothing breeze through the mask. I would never recommend a product I won't personally endorse, so here's the proof. Every night, I curl up with my body pillow, my fan blowing, and my Manta Sound sleep mask playing soft ASMR into my ears. The speakers are high quality, delivering clear sound without any distortion, whether that be ASMR, a gentle rain, whale songs, or whatever else might help you drift off into a peaceful night's sleep. So head on over to mantasleep.com and use code CAH for a 10% discount on your first mask. That's mantasleep.com, or .ca if you're in Canada like me, and use code CAH for classic aerospace history. The X-15 predates NASA, quite significantly. Instead of going back to Apollo to start this story, we need to go back a little further to the practical origins of the spaceflight world, Nazi Germany. When we think about the V-2 program, the ballistic missile that employed the works of Robert Goddard and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky to produce the first vehicle capable of passing the Kármán line and entering space, we tend to think only about Wernher von Braun. While von Braun did lead the V-2 team and was chiefly responsible for its design, there were several other minds at work within the Peenemünde Research Center in Germany. Furthermore, at this facility, the V-2 wasn't the only project being pursued. Necessity is the mother of all invention, and as the war became more desperate, the Peenemünde team performed extensive, though often incomplete, research into supersonic and hypersonic aircraft. In 1935, Adolf Bussmann presented the concept of swept wings, which delayed the onset of shock waves and redefined supersonic designs. The work remained largely theoretical as Germany prepared for large-scale military operations, but at the Peenemünde Research Center, they found a new opportunity. There, Walter Dornberger, German artillery engineer, found himself a leader of the Aggregat program. The Aggregat aimed to assemble a series of ballistic missiles, all with different purposes, the most successful of which would be the A4, better known as the V-2. However, some of Dornberger's work employed winged aggregate prototypes, including implementing the swept wing design. A few were tested in Peenemunde's supersonic wind tunnel, and a swept wing variant of the A4 flew to a speed of Mach 4, but failed during the controlled glide phase. The work was left largely stalled when the base V-2 model was successful, and then fully cancelled once Germany surrendered. Dornberger's ideas would remain on paper and in his head until 1952, when they found new life across the Atlantic Ocean. While many of the Operation Paperclip scientists would be employed by the United States Army and Air Force, Dornberger spent only 3 years developing guided missiles for the Air Force before he started work for the Bell Aircraft Corporation in 1950. While there, he wrote a concept study proposing a, quote, ionosphere research plane, outlining preliminary requirements for a rocket-powered hypersonic aircraft capable of reaching about Mach 6 and an altitude of 50 to 75 miles, the edge of the ionosphere. This was effectively an expansion on the idea of the Silbervogel, a suborbital bomber that could skip along the edge of the atmosphere and end up landing halfway around the world from where it began. In 1952, Robert J. Woods, chief engineer at Bell Aircraft, wrote a memo to NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. An agency founded for aeronautical research, NACA produced a number of air intakes, cowlings, and airfoils that are still used today and played a key role in producing parts for military aircraft during World War II. With the submitted proposal, Woods stated that, quote, the NACA is the logical organization to carry out the basic studies in spaceflight control and stability, and that they should set up a small group to, quote, evaluate and analyze the basic problems of spaceflight. the proposal was taken under advisement, though initially opposed by NACA leadership. Believing it to be too developmental and less important than in-atmosphere flight research, then-director of NACA Smith J. DeFrance stated that, quote, "A study group of any size is not warranted, believing NACA should leave development projects to the military." Eventually, unsolicited proposals for research aircraft were submitted to NACA. One submitted by Hubert Drake and L. Robert Carman called for a two-stage system in which a larger carrier aircraft would lift a smaller manned research plane. A three-man study group was formed within NACA to further develop the ideas, reviewing ongoing ICBM work being done by Convair and identifying the main difficulties of hypersonic flight and atmospheric reentry. By 1953, the military had gotten involved, with a Scientific Advisory Board aircraft panel concluding that now was a good time for another cooperative Air Force NACA project. The previously designed X-planes, such as the Bell X-1 and X-2, had seen several perceived successes, spurring political and philosophical support for more advanced research aircraft. By 1954, an ad hoc hypersonic research group that included Chairman John Becker and mechanical engineer Maxime Fazet had set a goal of designing a craft capable of reaching Mach 7, noting that this would permit a wide range of operating and heating conditions. They completed a tentative design in April, performing wind tunnel tests in mid-1954 and continuing into late 1955. These tests resulted in the development of the wedge tail, a vertical stabilizer with a 10-degree wedge angle that allowed the aircraft to achieve the range of altitudes required for a safe high-drag, high-lift re-entry. Further testing refined the proposed materials for the craft, as well as potential propulsion systems. At this stage, the vehicle concept was, quote, "little more than an object of about the right general proportions and the correct propulsive characteristics to achieve hypersonic flight. In short, it was pure function, no form. It had exactly one goal, achieving hypersonic flight, and nothing further went into the design as of yet." After 3 months of investigations, NACA Director Hugh Dryden submitted a letter to the Air Force headquarters stating that NACA wanted to start a new hypersonic aircraft research program. After a meeting between the two organizations, it was decided that while the military would continue studying the NACA proposal, Dryden would seek approval for the project from the Department of Defense. Though they all agreed that giving it a military purpose makes it easier to find funding, it was difficult to find a specific military purpose, and the project was instead presented as a dedicated research airplane. A design for this new plane began to take shape, being inspired by previous supersonic aircraft developed by Douglas Aircraft. The D5581, which loosely competed with the Bell X-1 in the 1940s, would progress to the 5582, being the second of 3 planned phases. The 5582, dropped from beneath the wing of a B-29 bomber, became the first aircraft to hit Mach 2, or twice the speed of sound. The third phase of the Douglas program would never see approval, though Douglas had proposed the D671, the design of which fit roughly the same performance requirements that would be needed from the X-15, though several aspects were unsuitable for the expected peak temperatures the vehicle would be subjected to. The Navy would decline further development of the Douglas concept in late 1954. The choice of engine for the X-15 was complicated. Rocket engines for use in aircraft were already established, used in the 5582 and pioneered all the way back in 1929 by Opel Rack in Germany, but the real question was which engine. 4 were considered: the Aerojet XLR-73, the Bell XLR-81, the North American NA-5400, and the Reaction Motors XLR-10. You may be wondering what the common prefix of XLR stands for. It's Experimental Liquid Rocket. At this time, rocket engines, especially liquid-fueled ones, were still very much a burgeoning technology, and this name scheme allowed the US Air Force and Navy to easily distinguish test engines from more mature ones, which would be designated simply LR. The entire system would fall out of use by the late 1960s, once rocket technology was a little more developed. Each of the 4 engines offered different benefits. The Aerojet engine was restartable mid-flight by electric ignition and could vary its thrust between 50 to 100%. The Bell engine had been based on the engine used in a missile and used a minimum number of safety components to save weight. The North American engine offered little to the program, despite inclusion in the list of candidates. Its thrust was about half of the other engines, though its turbopump assembly was capable of supporting a much more powerful engine. The Reaction Motors XLR-10 seemed the most promising, though Reaction Motors had actually abandoned further development in favor of a more powerful derivative. As it stood, the XLR-10 produced nearly twice the amount of thrust of the other engines, 20,000 pounds at sea level. At the same time, it could not be throttled or restarted, and in fact, wasn't even rated for human flight. By May of 1955, the project had a name, Project 1226, and the aircraft was to be officially designated the X-15. At the same time, proposals to develop the airframe had come in from Bell, Douglas, North American, and Republic. While each proposal looked relatively the same on the surface, they all took slightly different approaches to the problems presented. Bell seemed like a likely candidate, already having developed the X-1, the world's first supersonic aircraft, as well as having their own in-house group that built rocket engines. The Douglas proposal obviously built off the 558 series, taking a unique approach to the temperature problem with a distinctive structure of magnesium alloy. They were also the only proposal that used conventional landing gear, with 2 main wheels, a nose wheel, and a tail wheel. The other proposals suggested landing skids for the purposes of saving weight. North Americans seemed to be at a disadvantage with their proposal. Bell and Douglas had already built supersonic aircraft, while North American hadn't. However, their proposal had a unique focus. The others worked at designing a plane that met the performance requirements, but North American, quote, determined that the specification performance can be obtained with very moderate structural temperatures. However, the airplane has been designed to tolerate much more severe heating in order to provide a practical temperature band within which exploration can be conducted. Basically, they had future-proofed their design to go above and beyond the expected initial performance requirements. By June of 1956, North American had officially won the contract, granting $5.3 million for 3 X-15s, a full-scale mock-up, wind tunnel models, propulsion test articles, and the modification of a B-36 carrier aircraft. The first X-15 was set to be delivered by October 31, 1958. 2 years were spent refining the proposed North American design, doing wind tunnel testing and making tiny adjustments to the size, shape, and position of things like the fuselage tunnels, vertical surfaces, landing skids, and more. A major point of discussion was a pilot escape system. A recent Air Force policy directive required an encapsulated escape system on all new aircraft, but this received pushback as such a system would add weight and delay the aircraft's development. After several meetings at Wright Airfield, the Air Force would direct North American to incorporate an ejection seat, but not a full escape capsule. Further testing refined the aircraft's ability to handle critical loads during initial acceleration and re-entry phases and maximum temperatures during re-entry. To compensate for the up to 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperatures it would be subjected to, portions of the outer fuselage would use Inconel X, a heat-resistant nickel alloy. Several human factor concerns were present early in the program. Testing estimated that an X-15 pilot would be subjected to around 5 Gs during acceleration, and because of this, a unique side stick controller was developed that used an armrest to support the pilot's arm, allowing him to maintain control while the acceleration was pushing his arm toward the rear of the cockpit. Because the X-15 would have 2 separate attitude control systems, a conventional center stick operated control surfaces and was mechanically linked to the side stick, allowing them to be used interchangeably. A third stick controller above the left console operated a ballistic control system. In spaceflight, we know these better as reaction control systems, a series of hydrogen peroxide jet thrusters that could be used to orient the vehicle at high altitudes where there wasn't enough atmosphere to rely on lifting surfaces. In December of 1956, a full-scale X-15 mock-up was subjected to a development engineering inspection. This resulted in 84 requests for alterations, with 12 rejected by the board and 22 deferred for further study. Following this, the design configuration was finalized and construction of the first aircraft began in September of 1957, and before it was finished, a changing of the guard would take place. In 1957, spaceflight was making its transition from theory to reality. The International Geophysical Year led to both the United States and the Soviet Union making promises of putting the first artificial satellites into Earth orbit. While work to achieve this was being done, NASA began to wonder about the potential of a non-military space agency. Up until now, flight testing of captured V-2 sounding rockets and development of new rocket technology had fallen under the purview of the US military. Even the delivery of the first American satellite, Explorer 1, was divided among the 3 main branches of the US military: the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. The Air Force was working on the Atlas rocket, the Navy worked on Vanguard, and the US Army, backed by the V-2 mastermind Wernher von Braun, developed the Redstone missile. The US government initially backed the Navy Vanguard, as it was the only launch vehicle that wasn't already a dedicated military missile, and this put more of a civilian face on the Explorer satellite project. While the Army would eventually win this fight and launch Explorer 1 on a Juno 1 rocket derived from the Redstone, NASA had assigned several committees to review the concept of a civilian space agency. In 1958, NASA organized a, quote, special committee on space technology, which included Wernher von Braun as the head of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency's Large Booster Program. After the meetings were held, but about 2 weeks before Explorer 1 would launch, NASA Director Hugh Dryden published, quote, a national research program for space technology stating, "It is of great urgency and importance to our country both from consideration of our prestige as a nation as well as military necessity that this challenge be met by an energetic program of research and development for the conquest of space. It is accordingly proposed that the scientific research be the responsibility of a national civilian agency. NASA is capable, by rapid extension and expansion of its effort, of providing leadership in space technology." Dryden's work would then lead to the President's own Science Advisory Committee writing a memorandum encouraging Eisenhower to create a civil space program that would allow NASA to expand its work, quote, with a minimum of delay. NACA subsequently published more recommendations, including the development of a hydrogen-fluorine rocket. By April of 1958, Eisenhower would submit a bill to create a National Aeronautical and Space Agency, changing NACA's former role of research into one of large-scale development and operations. The bill passed, and on July 28, 1958, Eisenhower officially established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA would absorb all of NACA into itself, including all of its employees, its annual $100 million budget, 3 major research laboratories, and 2 small test facilities. Von Braun's team at the ABMA, as well as earlier U.S. Air Force research efforts, would also transfer to NASA, and in December of 1958, NASA also gained the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, previously operated by Caltech. All of this was occurring while the first X-15s were being constructed. What had begun as a NACA project would begin to fly as a NASA project, but before we get to that, let's talk about 2 more things: high-altitude girdles and the million-horsepower engine. I discussed at length the blurry line between pressure suit and spacesuit in my video A Brief History of Spacesuits. High-altitude flights that required pressure compensation were being carried out well before manned spaceflight went from theory to reality. At the time of the X-15 program, though, pressure suits were just barely out of the realm of science fiction. The David Clark Company had been producing anti-G suits for the Air Force since about 1949, building on early efforts to use inflatable bladders to apply compression on the body during high-altitude flights. They worked. An early X-1 flight resulted in a rapid cabin depressurization, and a Clark-designed pressure suit automatically activated to keep the pilot uncomfortable but alive. Though effective, partial pressure suits have the drawback of being bulky and very difficult to move in when pressurized. Efforts to solve this resulted in new fabrics and advances in regulators, and David Clark eventually realized that he could instead produce a workable full pressure suit weighing about 35 pounds, which is about 75 pounds lighter than early estimates made by North American. An inner nylon mesh called LinkNet helped control inflation and enhance the range of motion, eliminating the need for bellows at the limb joints needed in previous suits. The David Clark XMC-2DC prototype, after some further development, became the MC-2 suit, which would eventually become a standard for high-altitude flights in the Air Force, but first it would find its home in the X-15 program. The pilots had their suits. Speaking of the pilots, who were they? Unlike later NASA astronaut selection, the X-15 program didn't have a single formal competitive selection process. Instead, pilots were assigned from the participating organizations, namely the newly formed NASA or former NACA, the Air Force, the Navy, and from North American themselves, taking advantage of their previous experience as test pilots. These were military veterans who made their post-service career out of flying experimental vehicles that were very fast, very powerful, and often very unsafe. Many were even chosen for their previous experience with rocket-powered aircraft like the X-1, and while 8 of them would receive their astronaut wings by flying higher than 50 miles, only 2 would go on to fly spaceflight missions with NASA. Joe Engle, who flew the Space Shuttle prototype Enterprise as well as STS-2 and STS-51I, and a man who was initially rejected from astronaut selection due to his status as a civilian pilot, Neil Armstrong. Now let's quickly talk about the million-horsepower engine. We already discussed the 4 perspective engines that were considered, but the thing is, none of these ended up being chosen. While the reaction motor's XLR-10 was the most promising, it was lacking in several areas, requiring major modifications to meet the needs of the X-15. A new design was proposed and developed: the XLR-99, a single-chamber turbopump-fed engine that used anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen with hydrogen peroxide driving the turbopump. Capable of delivering around 60,000 pounds of thrust, it was throttleable between 50 and 100%, restartable, and became the first large man-rated rocket engine of its kind. It was to be developed and tested at the newly built Rocket Engine Test Facility at Edwards AFB. Early tests saw failures due to vibrations, pump seal leaks, and corrosion problems, which significantly delayed development, and the program wasn't prepared to wait for it. As a result, the first flights of the X-15 would actually use a pair of XLR-11 engines, leaving it underpowered compared to its design goals. Flights of the X-15 would, of course, be conducted at Edwards. Earlier in the 1950s, a $120 million effort had been made to establish the Air Force Flight Test Center out at the lake beds, buying out the nearby silt mines, constructing a 15,000-foot concrete runway, and relocating the entire base 2 miles west of its original location. Previous rocket planes such as the X-1 and X-2 were able to conduct their flights directly over Edwards and the surrounding lake beds. However, the X-15 needed a lot more space, a straight flight corridor of almost 500 miles with equipment to establish telemetry and communications and suitable emergency landing areas across the entire route. Construction of this new range, approved in 1955, was projected to cost $1.5 million and consisted of 3 new tracking stations across Nevada. The desire to gather more than just engine-related information such as structural, flight path, temperature, and cosmic ray concentrations would result in the final cost being closer to $4.2 million. One amusing note about determining if a lake bed could support the weight of an X-15 landing on it is how incredibly non-technical the process was. A large steel ball, nicknamed the Imperial Ball, was dropped from 6 feet and the impression was measured. That was it. If the impression was less than 3.25 inches deep, the lake bed was approved. Also worth noting that kneeling next to that ball is none other than Neil Armstrong himself. The X-15 was one of the first programs in which simulators played a major role in developing the aircraft and its flight profiles. Engineers used simulators to determine heating loads, the effects of proposed technical changes, and developing abort scenarios. The simulators were powered by 3 EAI PACE 231R analog computers containing 101 function generators, 32 servo amplifiers, and 5 electronic multipliers. The hardware aspect of the simulator wasn't fancy: a mocked-up cockpit, instruments, and a television screen. Much like with the Mercury program, pilots spent a considerable amount of time in this simulator not just to train, but to help engineer the aircraft and place controls in the optimum position for usage. One of the primary contributions of the Navy to the X-15 project was the use of a centrifuge used in a dynamic simulator to recreate the acceleration pilots would experience during their flights. These led to several rearrangements of instruments to reduce eye movement, as the high acceleration would cause a pilot's field of view to become narrower and narrower. Moving instruments closer together allowed the pilot to view as much information as possible without moving his head, a task that was considerably difficult when experiencing high G-forces. In addition to ground simulators, pilots also trained in a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, which closely approximated the wing loading of an X-15 during landing. This also allowed the pilots to establish geographic checkpoints and get the lay of the land for X-15 flights, in addition to practicing for emergency landings. Pilot Al White later stated that, quote, "With gear down, speed brake extended at idle power, and that drag chute deployed, the airplane was comparable to the X-15 on approach. I would start at about 25,000 feet, pick a spot on the lakebed, and see how close I could come to touching down on that spot. With all the room on the lakebed, it was not necessary to hit a spot, but it is always nice to have that much margin for error. I flew this trainer as much as I could in preparation for that day that never came." In addition to the Starfighter, an NT-33A was also used to simulate a brief 60-second period of time that consisted of piloting the X-15 during re-entry. No one had ever left the atmosphere at this time, and there was concern that the rapidly changing stability of the craft coming back down would pose an unusually demanding piloting task. A unique flight plan would have the plane enter a shallow dive at 17,000 feet and then pull up to a ballistic trajectory that produced about 60 seconds of 0G, and the pilot would then use a controller to establish the correct re-entry pitch attitude. The controller didn't actually do anything, as the NT-33A didn't have a ballistic control system, but would change the displayed attitude on the instrument panel. The pilot wore a hood that would allow them to only see the instruments and not the outside world, preventing confusion between the simulated and actual attitude of the aircraft. These simulations would also practice multiple control malfunctions and failure possibilities, and if the pilot was unable to recover from a simulated failure, an instructor in the back cockpit would recover them with his own controls. The concept of a carrier aircraft for the X-15 was not exactly new, but there were several decisions to be made in this regard. The initial design used a Convair B-36 with an idea to partially enclose the X-15 within its bomb bay, much like early X-1 flights had been. 4 different schemes for loading the X-15 into the bomber were considered, including putting the X-15 into a pit that could then be raised up, or alternatively, jacking up the carrier's nose gear. One particularly complex scheme suggested physically removing the X-15's vertical stabilizer, sliding it underneath the bomber, and then reattaching it. However, in 1957, just as North American was preparing to modify several B-36s, the X-15 Joint Operations Committee began considering alternatives. A survey identified 3 possibilities: the Convair B-58 Hustler, the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker, and the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. Despite several disadvantages such as high maintenance costs and the repositioning of its forward landing gear, the B-52 was selected primarily for its performance. It was faster than a B-36, and because it was relatively new, spare parts for repairs were far more readily available. Of course, the plan of keeping the X-15 partially enclosed in the bomb bay would no longer happen. She would instead be mounted underneath the wing, which was capable of supporting up to 50,000 pounds of weight, about 20,000 pounds more than the X-15. In addition to the landing gear move, several other modifications were made to the B-52. The most obvious was a large pylon underneath the right wing that would serve as an attach point, and a notch at the back of the wing to accommodate the X-15's vertical stabilizer. More subtle changes included moving the number 3 right main wing fuel cell to allow for the pylon, changes to the avionics system, installation of cameras, addition of a launch operator station on the upper rear flight deck, and removal of all military systems such as the tail turret and the defensive fire control system. However, the carrier and simulator aircraft were not the only additional aircraft in the X-15 program. You may wonder how we have such spectacular footage of the X-15 in operation, and that is thanks mostly to chase aircraft. These are planes that follow a subject aircraft. Think of the two T-38s that would escort the space shuttle on its way to the ground for the purposes of recording as well as watching out for any potential problems with it. The X-15 used up to 5 chase planes depending on the flight profile. 3 would be used for earlier low-speed flights, 4 for most research flights, and 5 for the longer range flights. The first, usually an F-100F Super Sabre, but later a Northrop T-38A, would fly in formation with the carrier aircraft, watching as the X-15 tested its various systems. The F-100 turned out to be a poor choice for this, as it struggled to stay slow enough to follow along during a right-hand turn, but the T-38 fixed this. Chase 2, an F-104 Starfighter, would also follow at launch, but was meant to provide assistance in the event of an emergency landing, which was needed on a few occasions when engine failures occurred soon after ignition. Chase 3, also an F-104, would cover landings at the middle lake beds on shorter flights, and would take off 30 minutes before the X-15 separated and ignited its engine. Chase 4 would cover the Edwards landing area, taking off at the same time as Chase 3 to orbit around uprange of the flight path. Often, this plane, another F-104, would identify the X-15 when it dumped residual propellant, as it was too small and difficult to see at a distance. The 5th chase plane was usually either a photography plane or another X-15 pilot who just felt like tagging along. In fact, many of the chase pilots would be other X-15 pilots most of the time. Other aircraft performed support functions. The NASA Goonie Bird, a Douglas R-4D, which was developed from the DC-3S, would ferry men and supplies uprange and inspect the lake beds. Several Lockheed C-130s would transport fire engines and other materials around, and one would orbit midway down the flight path with a flight surgeon in the case of an emergency. Piasecki H-21 Shawnee helicopters would carry more medical personnel and supplies. In 1957, before the X-15 began to fly, the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. The space race had begun, and as a result, interest in the X-15 program began to grow, from the military, from political leaders, and even from the public. Several news stations had coverage of the first few flights, bringing an unprecedented amount of media coverage to Edwards. However, once Project Mercury was underway, specifically Alan Shepard's first suborbital flight, public attention shifted to Cape Canaveral. Some believe this may have worked to the X-15 program's benefit. It focused on making incremental changes and doing highly specialized research that, after it's been seen a few times, isn't that exciting. It's the kind of thing the public tends to lose interest with quickly. Note the decreased attention on Apollo missions taking place after Apollo 11. There were even a variety of proposals to use the X-15 to put a man in orbit before the Soviets, however, most were not very serious, and none were put under much consideration. Not the least of which was due to a lack of booster rockets available at the time. Even if there was one capable of lofting a complicated lifting re-entry vehicle, the ICBMs of the era had a serious likelihood to, blow up. And the X-15 did not have an escape system. The only serious proposal was the X-15B from engineer Harrison Storms, which proposed using 2 strapped-together Navajo boosters as a first stage, a single booster for a second stage, and a stripped-down X-15 with a Rocketdyne XLR-105 sustainer engine for the third stage. After 3 orbits, it would return to land at Edwards using re-entry profiles already developed for the original X-15. However, when Storms returned from Washington, he informed the X-15 program's crew that there were, quote, exactly 421 other people who had competing proposals, and the X-15B quietly faded out of sight. On October 15, 1958, North American rolled out the first X-15 just 2 weeks after NACA had ceased to exist and was replaced with NASA. Note the lack of the NASA name on the vertical stabilizer of X-15-1 during its rollout ceremony. Newspapers and newsreels heralded the X-15 as the first American entry in the space race, despite entering space being far from a major goal of this small black airplane. Flights were developed weeks or months before they occurred, researchers developing requirements for data gathered under specific conditions and using that to lay out a specific flight plan. Engineers would determine thrust settings, climb angles, pushover times, and data gathering maneuvers. They would then present this plan to a pilot who would spend a significant amount of time in the ground simulators as well as in the air to practice flying off-design flights in the case of a failure. The X-15 would generally be mated to the carrier aircraft the day before flight day, with ground crews sometimes working through the night to prepare the airplane for flight. Workers would describe eerie floodlight-filled scenes of surreal fog created by liquid oxygen vapor drifting around the area before the pilot arrived very early in the morning. He would first go into a support van to don his pressure suit and hook up biomedical instruments, taking about 15 minutes to do so. After entering the aircraft, ground crews would hook up various lines, hoses, and straps for life support and monitoring their vitals, and after about 30 minutes, the canopy would finally be closed. Service carts were disconnected, the carrier aircraft was started up, and it would taxi to the end of the runway. The ground crew removed the safety pins from the X-15 release hooks, and then the carrier aircraft took off. It would climb to 25,000 feet while circling above Edwards, just in case an emergency landing needed to be made. Once at altitude, it would point toward the launch lake and climb to 45,000 feet. Mission rules dictated that if a serious problem occurred during this time period, the X-15 would be jettisoned. Pilot Scott Crossfield would later state, quote, "It was not heroics, it was simple mathematics. Better to lose one man than four." Although the X-15 did have a chance to survive if they had enough advance notice to turn on the APUs, without which they had no flight controls or radios. Of course, the ejection seat was also always an option. At 12 minutes before the X-15 was released, events began to ramp up. The X-15 pilot would start the APUs and run through pre-launch checklists, testing the X-15 systems, flight controls, ballistic control systems, and ensuring all switches were set where they were supposed to be. The first chase plane would observe the X-15 during these tests to ensure everything was working. At 8 minutes, the B-52 began a long sweeping turn towards Edwards. The X-15 pilot began activating the propulsion systems. At 2 minutes, the X-15 pilot started the data recorders and turned on the cameras. At 1 minute, the XLR-99 engine was set to pre-cool. More checks were performed. The pilot took a deep breath. 3, 2, 1, launch. It took a little while to get to the first flight. X-15-1 arrived at Edwards in October of 1958, and ground runs with the APUs began in December. Problems with overheating bearings, seizing turbines, and valve failures resulted in what Scott Crossfield later called a, quote, "sleepless week of sheer agony." The primary culprit was a sympathetic vibration that transferred through the mounting bulkhead, and North American had to devise a new mounting system that separated the APUs into two bulkheads. Significant help for the preparations for first flights would come from Crossfield, who arguably knew more about the X-15 than any other single person. He would describe the day of the first flight as a carnival at dawn, and would frequently wear his pressure suit during these prep times, despite the daytime desert temperature. He believed that his presence in a ready-to-go state kept ground crew morale high. He flew the first captive flight, exercising the flight controls while the X-15 remained attached to the B-52. At 30,000 feet, Crossfield turned off the cabin pressurization system and opened the ram air door, which equalized the pressure of the cabin with the outside air. This was to test the pressure suit, which immediately inflated. Crossfield described his movements as slightly constrained and awkward, but he was still able to reach all of the controls. Near the end of the flight, he extended the X-15 landing gear just to make sure it worked. The next step after the captive flight was a glide and landing test without the use of the XLR-99 engine. After an aborted test run due to a radio failure, the B-52 and X-15 pair spent nearly 2 hours conducting further tests before another radio failure combined with APU problems caused a second abort. A third attempt failed when the stability augmentation system failed and a bearing in one of the APUs overheated. Despite a series of improvements implemented, the APUs would be a source of irritation throughout the entire program, and overall reliability was considered marginal at best. By May of 1959, North American began doing ground tests of the interim doubled-up XLR-11 engines with Crossfield in the cockpit. He was also slated to fly the glide test, of which another attempt failed in June before even leaving the runway. Crossfield reported smoke in the cockpit caused by an overheating ventilation fan motor. However, finally, 3 days later on June 8, 1959, the successful glide test began. At 08:38 hours at an altitude of 37,550 feet, X-15-1 and pilot Scott Crossfield dropped from the B-52. Separation was clean, and Crossfield rolled to the right. While he was usually an obedient pilot, he allowed himself to deviate just a tiny bit from the flight plan, performing one aileron roll, just for fun. However, the flight quickly turned serious as the X-15 began to pitch wildly around. Crossfield later stated, quote, "The nose of the X-15 pitched up sharply. It was a maneuver that had not been predicted by the simulator. I was frankly caught off guard. Quickly I applied corrective elevator control. The nose came down sharply, but instead of leveling out, it tucked down. I applied reverse control. The nose came up, but much too far. Now the nose was rising and falling like the bow of a skiff in a heavy sea. I could not subdue the motions." What the X-15 was doing is called porpoising, and as it did this, it was sinking toward the desert at 200 miles an hour. Despite this, Crossfield landed safely, sliding 3,900 feet and turning slightly to the right. He later stated he believed the airplane was exhibiting what's called static instability, small pitch disturbances that were causing the craft to divert from its trimmed attitude rather than return to it. However, the real culprit was the side stick controller. It used small hydraulic actuators to assist the pilot, which had been restricted by the engineers based on a best guess of the range of movement required. However, the guess was wrong, and a cable in the control system was stretching and retracting unexpectedly as a result. A simple adjustment solved this problem. Crossfield's landing was not particularly hard, but inspections showed that bell cranks in the landing skids had bent, and there were no instruments on them to examine it. However, engineers believed that the shocks had bottomed out and stayed there from the high landing loads, and they were modified to hopefully account for this in the future. Despite this, there will be more problems while preparing for the first powered flight. Despite the successful glide test, the testing of the interim engine was not going well. Valves and regulators in the propellant system were experiencing significant problems. One test, ending with purging the hydrogen peroxide lines with a new hose, caused a thin film of oil to run into the lines, which resulted in an explosion that ran through the entire engine compartment. The Edwards fire crew acted quickly, but one crewman was badly burned. Finally, after multiple fixes and changes to the engine systems, Scott Crossfield made the first powered flight using X-15-2 on September 17, 1959. At 08:08 a.m., the plane was released at 37,600 feet. The two XLR-11 engines ignited and accelerated the craft to Mach 2.11 and an altitude of 52,341 feet during 224 seconds of powered flight. After performing another unregulated aileron roll, Crossfield landed 9 minutes and 11 seconds after launch, at which point it was quickly noticed that a fire was burning near the ventral stabilizer. That's the one on the bottom. It was quickly extinguished, and investigation revealed a pump diffuser case had cracked and sprayed fuel throughout the engine compartment. It had burned through and melted aluminum tubing, fuel lines, and valves, sending it back to North American for about 3 weeks for repairs. The second powered flight went even worse. As the engine attempted to start, a chamber exploded and started a fire. 13 seconds of powered flight hadn't been enough to get the X-15 up to Mach 1, and there wasn't a good attitude to dump the remaining fuel. The aircraft touched down at approximately 185 miles per hour and a high descent rate. Crossfield said the nose slammed down hard and the airplane plowed across the desert floor, slowing much faster than usual. She came to a complete stop within 1,500 feet instead of the usual 5,000 feet. When the nose gear bottomed out, the fuselage quite literally broke in half, shearing 70% of the bolts that held it together. The broken fuselage dug into the lake bed, slowing her down further to a resting place. X-15-1 became the primary flight vehicle while 2 was being repaired in early 1960. Subsequent flights reached Mach 2.53 and heights of 66,800 feet. Tensions began to ease, with radio chatter heard of Crossfield joking with flight control that he was stuck in the mud after landing, though he was actually fine. 2 pilots were selected for accomplishing 2 different goals. Joseph Walker from NASA would concentrate on pushing the limits of how high the X-15 could get, while Major Robert White would push the envelope on speed. 4 other pilots would be rotated out for research flights that weren't directly tied to speed and altitude. As lower altitude flights continued, North American were struggling to get the ballistic control system operational. It hadn't been needed so far, but tests were experiencing leaks and poor centering characteristics in the valves. Crossfield tested the system in May of 1960 while the X-15 was still mated to the B-52. While an APU failure prevented a launch, North American considered the ballistic test successful, but did note that the upper nose thrusters coated the cockpit windscreen with peroxide, which turned to opaque frost due to the catalyst beds not coming up to temperature. A solution was implemented to install heaters on the catalyst beds, which promptly solved the problem. The first 30 flights of the X-15 used the interim XLR-11 engines, establishing a speed record of Mach 3.5 and an altitude record of 136,500 feet. The third X-15, equipped with the XLR-99, arrived at Edwards in June of 1959. At the same time, X-15-2 was removed from flight status to replace its engine with the XLR-99. Several ground tests were performed, one of which was rather interesting. Crossfield was experimenting with moving the throttle of the engine, and nothing appeared abnormal at first. Crossfield saw the main chamber pressure stabilize and then rapidly fall off before the engine shut down automatically. A valve malfunction light came on in the cockpit, and Crossfield moved the throttle to the off position. As he moved to restart the engine, he would later write, quote, "The reset button was depressed, at which time the airplane blew up." Centered forward of the engine compartment, the explosion caused the aircraft to separate just forward of the LOX tank, throwing the entire fuselage about 30 feet. Crossfield said, quote, "In the explosion, which is not describable, the cockpit translated abruptly forward and to the right with an acceleration beyond the experience of this pilot. The on-scene fire trucks arrived within 30 seconds, and Crossfield was pulled from the cockpit miraculously uninjured." Investigation determined the explosion was initiated by an overpressurized ammonia tank. Due to the toxicity of ammonia fumes, a venting system was installed to the test stand that would carry the fumes to a nearby pond to dilute them. However, the regulator valve had stuck in the open position, and the vent valve was only partly open, creating back pressure that was too much for the tank to handle. When it ruptured, it damaged the hydrogen peroxide tank, and when it mixed with the ammonia, the result was an explosion. Despite the flaw being caused primarily by a system that only existed for ground tests, modifications were made to the gas regulators and valves, and the aircraft was rebuilt at a cost of $4.75 million. The first proper XLR-99 flights were low and slow, that being Mach 2 at 50,000 feet. Though the first experienced an early shutdown, it was still more or less a success. Crossfield made 2 attempts that aborted before launch due to APU failures, and then finally a successful flight in December of 1960, bringing her to Mach 2.97 at 81,200 feet using somewhat less than half of the engine's power. A subsequent flight successfully achieved throttling, shutdown, and restart objectives, and also marked the end of Scott Crossfield's work in the cockpit. He would then transfer to testing the Hound Dog cruise missile, and later work in the Apollo program. The first 2 years of flying showed the cancellations and aborts occurred for 5 main reasons: APU problems, XLR-11 problems, propellant system problems, bad weather, and heating and ventilation problems. When the XLR-99 was introduced, it became the primary reason for problems. This wasn't surprising. It was a brand new engine that represented a leap forward in rocket technology. It was simply experiencing growing pains. Things began to ramp up in 1961. The first government flight took place in March, with Bob White in the cockpit, reaching Mach 4.43, a world record, and an altitude of 77,450 feet. At this point, focus shifted to obtaining aerodynamic and structural heating data, with post-flight examinations showing a minor amount of buckling from thermal expansion. While it wasn't a problem now, NASA elected to install expansion joints to minimize buckling at higher Mach numbers. Later that month, the first flight using the improved David Clark pressure suit was performed by Joe Walker. After reaching 169,000 feet and experiencing 2 full minutes of weightlessness, there was around 45 seconds of heavy vibration during descent, an issue that would become known as structural resonance. This occurs when a powerful feedback control system connects to lightly dampened structural parts, such as welded components. In this case, a pitch rate gyro picked up vibration at one of the structure's natural frequencies and commanded an actuator to move at the same frequency, which keeps the shaking going. 2 systems fixed this: a notch filter that countered control surface input, and a feedback valve that dampened the stabilizer bending mode. Essentially, the former avoided the problem, while the latter countered the problem at its source. Walker's flight took place just 5 weeks before Alan Shepard's suborbital Mercury flight, marking the United States' entry into the manned space race. As a result, Congressman Roman Paczynski asked Walker to write a short report on his impressions of the flight as a kind of foreword to what Shepard would see later. Here is what he had to say. "I had plenty of time at the peak of the trajectory to make outside observations. The most impressive observation initially was the aspect of the sky overhead. The color I would describe as being a very deep violet blue, not indicative of a black shading, but an extremely dark bluish cast. The next thing is that you have no doubt from external visual cues that you're really high up. No difficulty is experienced in observing and identifying geographical features on the surface of the Earth, particularly in areas with which one is familiar. An outstanding aspect of this is the appreciation of relative heights or elevations, different levels of the surface. Mountains still stand out as mountains, and looking down into the Los Angeles basin, I could tell the smog is distinct from some low stratocumulus clouds along the seacoast. Areas which are heavily forested or under agricultural development could be separated from those areas where nothing was growing, and once again, if one were familiar with the territory, this is even easier to pick out. The curvature of the Earth was very apparent." Apparently, a quiet bantering rivalry grew between X-15 pilots and Mercury pilots. Milt Thompson and Joe Walker traveled to the Cape to watch Gus Grissom fly the second suborbital Mercury flight, and joked with him that the X-15 had almost as much thrust as the Redstone booster, and that the X-15 pilots were actually flying, while Mercury astronauts were simply along for the ride. The speeds were comparable, with the X-15's maximum speed falling about 500 miles per hour below the Redstone, though the astronauts were going much higher. This was, of course, nothing more than playful banter. However, apparently nobody told Tom Wolfe this when he wrote The Right Stuff. By June of 1961, government test pilots had been flying the X-15 for just over a year. Their 4 primary objectives, determining hypersonic aerodynamic heating rates, structural characteristics during high heating, hypersonic stability during boost and re-entry, and pilot performance, were all largely satisfied by the end of the year. It was found that pilot heart rates varied between 145 and 185 BPM, attributed mostly to the anticipatory stress of waiting for the launch to occur. It was also found that the pilots thought very little about the weightlessness, with Bob White commenting that, quote, "0G, while apparently an interesting area to consider, has no noticeable effect on the pilot control task for the approximate 2-minute period during which the weightless state was experienced." Earlier flights established ideal flight paths for re-entering from high altitude, maintaining a constant angle of attack until the desired G-loads were reached, at which point the angle of attack would gradually be decreased. Max Q, the maximum period of aerodynamic stresses on the vehicle, would occur just prior to level flight. The initial angle of attack would increase alongside the maximum altitude to keep the stresses within tolerance limits. Re-entries with the Stability Augmentation System, or SAS, were believed to be possible from early simulation results, at least with angles of attack up to 15 degrees. Past this, an instability would develop that would make the entire aircraft uncontrollable. However, these simulations had assumed that the horizontal stabilizer would be in a zero position, but it was more often 15 to 20 degrees leading edge down. When expanded tests accounted for this, it was realized that the maximum angle of attack was only about 8 degrees rather than 15. Joe Walker confirmed the problem was real in August of 1960 by intentionally turning off the roll dampers and gradually increasing his angle of attack. The plane began to oscillate on its yaw axis precisely as predicted. This led to development of a backup roll damper with its own sensors meant for emergency use only, as these high degree angles of attack were unlikely to be used very often anyway. Another change proposed, primarily to simply see what would happen if the ventral stabilizer was made smaller, was to take off the lower portion of it entirely. It was jettisoned at the end of each flight anyway, but there was very little wind tunnel data to run off of. Technicians built a temporary heat shield to bolt onto the bottom of the fixed portion of the ventral, and Bob Rushworth flew the first ventral off flight in October of 1961. Concerns were that with the ventral removed, the X-15 would have no directional control for the first second or two immediately after separating from the B-52. However, this didn't end up being the case. Rushworth's flight went off without a hitch. This prompted further testing in wind tunnels, but it would be another year before ventral off flights became routine. In April of 1962, Joe Walker flew the first flight that went almost all the way to design altitude, 246,700 feet. Once wind tunnel tests showed the ventral off format to be acceptable at high angles of attack and up to 400,000 feet in altitude, Jack McKay flew the second ventral off test in September, completely nominal. This also led to a realization of another benefit. Removing the lower ventral increased the lift-to-drag ratio from 4.25 to 4.5, allowing for slightly improved range, which would help with the eventual Mach 6 re-entries with more extreme trajectories. Throughout these earlier years, a number of things cropped up that, at a glance, seemed potentially catastrophic, yet wound up being non-issues. For instance, in October of 1961, a left outer windscreen developed a series of cracks, fracturing during re-entry from 217,000 feet. It was never even mentioned in the post-flight pilot report, but was heard over the radio for exactly 3 lines of chatter. Pilot Bob White to NASA 1 Forrest Peterson. "Okay, my outside windshield went." Peterson replies, "Understand outside pane?" White, "That's correct." And the two men moved on with the flight. On the very next flight, as White decelerated from Mach 6 to Mach 2.7, he declared, "Good Lord, not again." The entire windshield panel, this time the right side, had cracked so badly that White couldn't see out of it at all. He asked the chase plane to stay close, and even briefly considered blowing the entire canopy for landing, but ended up landing safely with it still on. During the first year of XLR-99 flights, nearly every single one experienced some manner of malfunction and shutdown immediately after launch. It always relit on the second try, causing it to become more of an annoyance than a major issue. Post-burnout malfunctions were more confusing, eventually traced back to a cavitation in the lube oil pump. This was solved by simply installing a delay timer that allowed the pump to cavitate for up to 6 seconds without triggering a shutdown, by which point the problem would resolve itself. The same flight that had seen the first minor window cracking was also the first to use the ballistic control system to maintain attitude. At about 217,000 feet, Bob White reported that the system worked as expected, though post-flight analysis noted that fuel consumption was higher than expected. To compensate for this, a system was installed that transferred residual propellant from the XLR-99 turbopump into the ballistic control system. These early years also saw the first use of temperature-sensitive paint, applied over the left side of the airplane in regions believed to experience the highest temperatures. Wedge-shaped areas of the wing leading-edge expansion joints and distance rearward were found to experience around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit at peak heating. Despite this being within the limits of the airframe, engineers installed small Inconel shields over the expansion joints to minimize the interference. 1962 saw one of the most well-known X-15 flights, Neil Armstrong's unintended atmospheric skip. Around the time North American had started constructing the X-15 airframes, the Air Force had already selected the MH-96 adaptive control system for use on the upcoming X-20 Dinosaur, a proposed orbital research plane that would never end up seeing a flight. While the MH-96 had seen some testing, the Air Force wanted to see how it worked on a higher performance aircraft. When X-15-3 exploded on the ground, the Air Force saw an opportunity and had the MH-96 installed in it when it was rebuilt. Potentially superior to the basic flight control system on the other two X-15s by having more redundancy by blending the ballistic control system with the aerodynamic controls above 90,000 feet, the MH-96 is what Armstrong was using when he took the X-15 out on the 4th evaluation flight and the longest flight of the entire program. The flight plan called for a peak altitude of 205,000 feet, and Armstrong would perform a handful of maneuvers on his way down to evaluate the performance of the MH-96. This aspect was a success, but at around 115,000 feet, Armstrong began his pullout, at which point the aircraft began to unexpectedly climb. Joe Walker on the ground noticed the increasing rate of climb and advised Armstrong to perform a hard left turn, rolling into a 60-degree left bank. When Walker advised the next turn, Armstrong realized that he was effectively above the atmosphere and he was not turning. He was skipping off of the atmosphere and proceeded to sail right by Edwards at Mach 3 and 100,000 feet, headed for Palmdale on a 90-degree bank with full nose-up stabilizer and unable to turn. Once one begins to skip off the atmosphere in this way, there's only one thing to do. Wait until it reaches peak altitude and starts to come back down again. By the time that happened, Armstrong was 45 miles south of Edwards and had nowhere near enough kinetic energy to make it back. He evaluated his options. Landing at Palmdale was impossible as the runway was concrete, which was not ideal for the X-15 landing skids. Instead, he settled for runway 45 at the extreme south end of Rogers Dry Lake, about as far away as one could get from the normal intended runway. Recovery and emergency vehicles raced at full speed to cover the 12-mile distance and meet him, and Armstrong touched down safely, completing the longest non-emergency miss in the program's history. In July of 1962, Bob White made a flight that was supposed to go to 282,000 feet, but the MH-96 failed just before launch. Instead of aborting, White reset the circuit breakers and the system appeared to work again, and at launch took a bit steeper of a climb angle than had been called for. This, combined with the engine producing a little more thrust and burning a little longer than usual, raised his maximum altitude by 32,750 feet, setting a new world record of 314,750 feet. This was the first X-15 flight that qualified a pilot for an astronaut rating. White had this to say about his view from the apogee of his flight. "You could see just about as far as you looked. I turn my head in both directions and you see nothing but the earth. It's just tremendous. You look off and the sky is real dark. I didn't think the impression would be much different than it was up around 250,000 feet, but I was impressed remarkably more than I was at that height. It amazed me. I looked up and was able to pick out San Francisco Bay, and it looked like it was down over there off the right wing and I could look out, way out. It was just tremendous, absolutely tremendous. You've seen pictures from high up in rockets, or those orbital pictures of what the guy sees out there. That's exactly what it looked like. The same thing." The next day, July 18th, President Kennedy presented the Robert J. Collier Trophy to 4 X-15 pilots, Scott Crossfield, Forrest Peterson, Joe Walker, and Bob White, for, quote, "invaluable technological contributions to the advancement of flight and for great skill and courage as test pilots of the X-15. Despite Crossfield being gone from the program for nearly 2 years at this point, and Peterson having one foot out the door, all 4 pilots turned out to accept what is generally considered the most prestigious recognition in all of aerospace. 1962 also saw the X-15's first truly bad day. Jack McKay launched on November 9th aboard X-15-2, headed for Mach 5.5 at 125,000 feet. However, when he ignited the engine, the ground crew asked McKay to verify his throttle position, and he confirmed that it was fully open. Unfortunately, the engine was only putting out about 35% of its intended power. Unable to quickly recalculate the flight plan, mission rules dictated that McKay shut down the engine entirely and make an emergency landing at Mud Lake. As far as emergency landings went, it seemed fairly routine until suddenly the X-15 wing flaps failed to operate. The plane made a hard landing at nearly 300 miles per hour. The left landing skid failed and the left horizontal stabilizer and wing dug into the lake bed, turning the vehicle and flipping it upside down. Realizing it was going over, McKay jettisoned the canopy just prior to the inversion, with the unfortunate result being that the first thing to hit the lake bed was his helmet. Rescue crews arrived quickly, struggling to get close to the crash site due to the fumes belching from the broken aircraft. The H-21 recovery helicopter maneuvered itself to use its rotor downwash to disperse the fumes as ground crews dug a hole and extracted McKay, loading him onto the C-130 and rushing to Edwards. He suffered crushed vertebra, but would go on to fly 22 more X-15 flights, eventually retiring from NASA due to the lasting effects of his injuries. 1963 saw the highest altitude flight of the entire program on the 22nd of August, piloted by Joe Walker. Simulators suggested the X-15 could achieve altitudes in excess of 400,000 feet, but there was skepticism about the aircraft's ability to re-enter from such heights. To provide a margin of safety, the maximum altitude was limited to 360,000 feet, providing a 40,000-foot bumper. Though that may sound like a lot, remember that Bob White had already exceeded his own altitude by 32,000 feet just a year prior. Furthermore, the XLR-99 wasn't a very precise engine, frequently producing thrust that varied by about 3,000 pounds. Walker's flight was delayed 3 times both due to weather and APU problems, and launch day suffered problems with radar tracking. However, once Walker launched, things went much more smoothly, ultimately reaching an altitude of 354,200 feet. By this time, the program had gathered virtually all of its data that was intended, and would now push into program extensions. X-15-2 was modified, now designated X-15A2. In an effort to push speed ratings, A2 was given a white ablative coating and a pair of external propellant tanks that would be jettisoned after being depleted. There was also a sky hatch, 2 upward opening doors behind the cockpit that would expose cameras and other experiments to the sky. The other 2 X-15s would remain as is to perform follow-on experiments that didn't require these extra speed boosts. 1964 was an uneventful year. Trouble with the stable platform forced the program to restrict flights to below 200,000 feet. The Air Force and NASA began modifying a batch of inertial guidance systems meant for the Dinosaur program, but it remained what was referred to as a quote, low year. Much of the work had shifted to temperature evaluations during re-entry, obtaining valuable information for how materials behaved under high temperatures and aerodynamic stress. This information would become valuable for the design of future spacecraft, especially for Apollo, as those capsules would be re-entering the atmosphere at much higher speeds than Mercury or Gemini ever did. The summer of 1964 saw the introduction of the completed X-15A2. It flew its first captive flight on June 15th, and its first free flight just 10 days later. Not bad for a checkout flight, Bob Rushworth used 77% thrust to reach Mach 4.59 and 83,000 feet, with the primary goals of both evaluating the modified plane as well as gaining preliminary experience with an ultraviolet stellar photography experiment. His NASA 1 controller on the ground, interestingly enough, was the last person to fly that same plane, Jack McKay, who had flown it as X-15-2 on his flight that had nearly destroyed it and nearly ended him. The second flight was a little less routine. After obtaining a maximum speed of Mach 5.23, the nose gear unexpectedly extended itself as the vehicle prepared to point back toward the ground. Rushworth noted hearing a loud bang, and the plane began to oscillate wildly. Rushworth put the dampers on and pulled the nose down to about 5 degrees, which seemed to level it out, except for a slight side slip to the left. He slowly came to realize the sound he heard was very similar to the sound of the gear deploying, leading him to realize that, at the very least, the door was open, though the reality was that the entire wheel had extended down. The cockpit began to fill with smoke, and the chase planes and ground control weren't able to confirm what had happened. He was advised to keep the X-15 at high altitude until it slowed down, thereby easing the stresses on the extended nose gear. Once Chase 3 confirmed that the gear was down and in fact undamaged, Rushworth proceeded with a landing. Worries that a strut had been damaged by the heat and aerodynamic pressure were confirmed when the tires disintegrated after touching down, but the plane still managed to come to a stop without serious difficulty. It turned out that the fuselage had expanded greater than the amount of slack built into the cable that released the landing gear, causing it to pull and release the gear. Engineers then redesigned the gear to provide positive retention of the gear system, keeping it from accidentally deploying under thermal stresses. Shortly afterwards, the expansion program began, utilizing the external tanks fashioned for the A2. Since a landing wasn't possible with the tanks attached, considerable effort was made to make sure that they would jettison when commanded using gas cartridge ejectors and a small solid-fueled sustainer rocket. They were also quite expensive, so they were equipped with a parachute recovery system, allowing them to be refurbished with only a small amount of impact damage. There was some concern about an emergency scenario in which the tanks needed to be jettisoned partially full. All wind tunnel tests assumed they would either be full or completely empty. A rapid propellant dump system was considered, but this was deemed too complicated, and management decided to continue as is. The risk was deemed reasonable. The XLR-99 had only ever shut down either at ignition or while throttling, and the flight plans didn't call for any throttling. In late 1965, the first flights using empty external tanks were performed, with everything going more or less as planned. Rushworth commented that roll stability was less than he had expected, but longitudinal control wasn't quite as bad. Ground-based trackers observed the tank separation and recovery process, noting that they didn't rotate nose down as much as expected, tumbling somewhat with the drogue chutes attached. By the end of this year, the eventual end of the program was in sight. The A2 was capable of pushing the flight envelope somewhat, but the aircraft were now essentially primary experiment carriers. Early 1966 was a period of downtime. Wet weather made landings impossible for several months, giving the program time to do maintenance and modifications. New instrument panels were introduced, which the pilots were less than enthusiastic about, but eventually with incorporation into the simulators, the frustrations calmed down. By summer of 1966, the program was ready to fly again, and Bob Rushworth made his final flight, which was also the first flight with full external tanks. There was a lot of hesitation on this flight. There was no direct instrumentation to determine whether the tanks were feeding correctly. Simulators showed that if one tank transferred but the other did not, the aircraft would quickly become completely uncontrollable. It was determined that if this situation appeared to be developing, the pilot would immediately jettison the tanks, shut down the engines, and make an emergency landing. During the flight out to the launch lake, Rushworth did a test of the feeding system by purging some of the internal fuel, then replacing it from the external tanks. While it seemed to work, shortly after launching from the B-52, the ground crew saw no flow of ammonia. The tanks were shut down, jettisoned, and an emergency landing in Mud Lake was made, safely. 1967 saw successful flights of the A-2 with the external tanks, and experiments were performed with ablative coatings as a precursor to space shuttle development concepts. This also helped the X-15 handle the aerodynamic heating loads expected at Mach 8. Initial flights with the ablator were made without the external tanks and with the addition of a ramjet at the bottom of the ventral stabilizer. With the ablator adding 125 more pounds than planned, the X-15 was barely able to exceed Mach 7. However, the ablator held up well. At the end of the year, despite so many close calls where pilots came out unscathed, tragedy finally struck the X-15 program. On November 15th, X-15-3 dropped away from the B-52 with Major Michael J. Adams at the controls on his 7th flight. His mission? Evaluate an Ames boost guidance display and conduct several experiments. About 1 minute after launch, an electrical disturbance caused the MH-96 dampers to trip up. Adams calmly reset the dampers and continued. After engine shutdown, Adams initiated a wing rocking maneuver to sweep an ultraviolet plume experiment up and down along the horizon. However, unbeknownst to him, the earlier electrical disturbance had fooled the flight control system into believing that dynamic pressure was higher than it actually was. As a result, the ballistic control system failed to engage at the altitude it was supposed to. As descent began, the aircraft began to drift and then entered a hypersonic spin as the dynamic pressure rapidly increased. Adams reported the spin and was very clearly distressed, but there was no recommended recovery technique for the X-15 in this situation. Adams managed to recover at 120,000 feet, then entered an inverted dive at Mach 4.7 with an angle of almost 45 degrees. The X-15 began to pitch wildly, effectively blocking any pilot inputs. At around 62,000 feet, at a speed of 2,800 feet per second, the aircraft broke apart entirely. An Air Force pilot spotted the wreckage, and it was quickly confirmed that Michael Adams was dead. The Air Force and NASA convened an accident board. It concluded that Adams had misinterpreted his instruments, exacerbated by the problems from the electrical disturbances, and combined with vertigo and stress of the emergency landing, leading to a fatal crash. The board made two major recommendations: install a telemetered heading indicator in the control room, and medically screen pilots for vertigo sensitivity. The Air Force posthumously awarded Adams an astronaut rating for his last flight in the X-15-3, which attained an altitude of just over 50 miles. This was the only fatality in the entire program. The true end of the X-15 program was decided by 1966. The Aeronautics and Astronautics Coordinating Board, in charge of activities between the Department of Defense and NASA, convened in July to essentially define the date the program would end. The two most important approved Air Force experiments would conclude at the end of 1967, leaving the program the exclusive responsibility of NASA from January 1, 1968 onwards. However, the two previously mentioned experiments ended up running well into 1968, and the program's life would extend until they were finished, depending on the NASA funding situation. The death of Mike Adams underscored concerns about the high risks and high costs associated with the program. By all rights, it was something of a miracle that only one life had been claimed so far. Finally, it was decided in December of 1967 that the program would end in exactly 1 year. The final year of the program saw only 8 missions. X-15A2 would not be among them. It was subjected to a series of load and thermal tests on the right wing on the ground and would never fly again. Bill Dana completed the 199th and final flight of the program on October 24th, reaching Mach 5.38 and 255,000 feet. There was meant to be another, giving it a nice round 200, but the program made 10 attempts to launch and were snubbed by weather and maintenance every single time. An attempt on December 12th even got airborne, but the X-15 inertial system failed and prevented a launch. By the end of the program, the 2 remaining planes were tired. Despite the flights being short, all 3 planes flew for just over 30 hours total, they were extremely strenuous. After every flight, they were practically taken apart entirely for inspections and maintenance, and then reassembled and tested some more. One engineer said that, quote, "My personal opinion is that we wore the airplanes out testing them in preparation for flight." The 2 remaining X-15s were put on display in museums. X-15-1 is at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. in the Milestones of Flight Gallery. X-15A2 is at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, Ohio. It's displayed with the attached external tanks in the Research and Development Gallery alongside other X-planes, such as the Bell X-1B. 3 mock-ups are located at Edwards, Pima Air and Space Museum, and Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum. The 2 B-52 motherships are on display at Pima and outside the north gate of Edwards. While the spiritual successor to the X-15, the Dinosaur, would never fly, the program was a massive success. It paved the way for hypersonic flights beyond the early X-planes, shaped our understanding of atmospheric reentry for lifting bodies, and pushed the envelope that, almost 60 years later, has still not been met and beat. Virtually everything that humanity now knows about hypersonic flight in the upper atmosphere is thanks to this rocket engine with wings in a cockpit. It was a wild era of danger and progress, and nothing like it will ever be seen again.